billionaire CEO never believed in love, until he fell for his shy assistant. Miami's South Point Park pier glowed against the Atlantic on a warm April night. Cruise ships moved slowly toward the ocean, their lights reflecting across the dark water. Victor Ashford, a billionaire known for his precision and control, stood in a tailored charcoal suit. The silver at his temples caught the glow from Miami Beach as he faced Destiny Clark, his assistant of 1 year. Destiny wore a simple navy dress, her natural curls lifted by the salt breeze. Tears streamed down her cheeks as Victor's voice shook for the first time in his billion-dollar career. "You've become the first person I think about every morning. Not because I need you to manage my schedule, but because I wonder what you think about things that have nothing to do with work. And that terrifies me." The man who built an $8.7 billion empire on cold logic was confessing feelings he never believed in. The assistant who had worked in quiet shadows now stood at the center of his breaking point. But how did a man who once called love a fairy tale for weak minds end up here, vulnerable and terrified? Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe because tomorrow we're dropping another story you won't want to miss. Let's begin. Victor Ashford's story began in Detroit during the 1980s, in a city fighting for its survival. The automotive collapse was more than an economic downturn, it was the slow breaking of a community. His father, once proud of his position on the assembly line, watched the plant gates close for the last time. Wages stopped, bills piled up, bankruptcy followed. Victor was only a boy, but the experience branded him with a lesson that never left. Love, loyalty, and emotion could cloud judgment, but financial security was the only constant worth fighting for. He learned early to trust numbers over feelings. While his classmates worried about basketball tryouts or Saturday dances, Victor taught himself coding in his bedroom. By 16, he was selling small software programs to local businesses, trading teenage leisure for the discipline of contracts and invoices. His motivation wasn't curiosity, it was survival. He wanted to build a life where no family member would ever stand in line for government aid again. That determination earned him a full scholarship to MIT. There, he refined his talent into something formidable. He developed algorithms capable of forecasting real estate market shifts with astonishing accuracy. By 28, Victor turned that skill into a fortune, identifying undervalued neighborhoods before anyone else. In Chicago's South Loop and Austin's downtown district, he bought properties when others dismissed them as hopeless. Within years, those same blocks transformed into thriving hubs, and Victor's net worth crossed the $100 million mark. Expansion followed. Seattle's tech corridor offered him a foothold in the software sector. San Francisco gave him a landmark building in the financial district. With each acquisition, his reputation grew. He was no gambler. Every move was calculated, supported by data no competitor could match. He wasn't just building wealth, he was building dominance. By his mid-30s, Ashford Global Enterprises stood as one of the most influential privately held companies in the United States. The crown jewel was a 60-story glass tower in Hudson Yards, Manhattan, with sweeping views of the Hudson River. The tower wasn't just an office. It was a symbol of how far Victor had come from Detroit's collapsing factories. From the command center on the top floor, his empire managed billions in assets spread across real estate, technology, and international investment. By conservative estimates, Ashford Global was valued at $8.7 billion. But with his success came a reputation colder than the steel and glass of his skyscrapers. The Wall Street Journal dubbed him the Ice King of American business, a man capable of firing 300 employees in a single morning without so much as a change in expression. Forbes published an interview where Victor dismissed love as a fairy tale we tell ourselves to justify irrational decisions. His words became famous in corporate circles, quoted as proof that he had no patience for what others called distractions. Inside his company, fear replaced admiration. Assistants came and went, each believing they could manage his demands, each leaving in tears. 7 assistants in 2 years, an extraordinary turnover in a world where proximity to a billionaire was considered a career-defining opportunity. Victor didn't raise his voice. He didn't insult or belittle. He simply demanded perfection without recognition, and for most people, that void was unbearable. His private office reflected the man himself. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of Manhattan's skyline, yet the space was stripped of warmth. No family photos, no artwork, no evidence of a personal life. His desk gleamed with polished precision, as if even sentimentality would be considered clutter. Clients and colleagues would leave meetings impressed by the efficiency, but many whispered afterward that the office felt less like a workplace and more like a machine. The emptiness wasn't limited to his surroundings. Victor had no visible relationships, no partner waiting at home, no circle of close friends. The empire was both his fortress and his prison, built with walls so high that even he could not see beyond them. And yet, there was one small detail that hinted at a hidden story. Every year, without exception, November 7th was marked as unavailable on his calendar. No meetings, no travel, no explanation. Not even his most trusted executives knew why. It was the only day he refused to negotiate, the only day his schedule remained closed. Few wondered about it out loud, but those who noticed sensed that the man who claimed emotions were useless still carried one secret memory he could not erase: the day his father died. Victor Ashford was, by every measure, the definition of American success: brilliant, disciplined, and untouchable. But his rise had come at the cost of anything resembling intimacy. He believed he had traded it for security, that feelings only led to loss. To everyone who studied his life, one fact seemed undeniable. The Ice King had built an empire of glass and steel, but he had no one to share it with. Destiny Clark's story began far from the skyscrapers of Manhattan. She grew up in Atlanta's West End, a neighborhood alive with resilience and struggle. When her mother passed away suddenly, Destiny was only 9. Her grandmother stepped in, raising her with a phrase she repeated often: "Quiet dignity is its own strength." Destiny absorbed those words, carrying them like armor through every challenge that followed. By the time she entered Georgia State University, Destiny understood that survival required both intelligence and discipline. She balanced 3 jobs while studying full-time, waitressing at a diner before sunrise, tutoring middle school students in the afternoon, and shelving books at the library until closing. There were days she walked across campus running on 3 hours of sleep, but she never complained. She graduated without fanfare, without luxury, but with a degree she had earned inch by inch. New York City was her next chapter. She arrived with 2 suitcases, $847 in her bank account, and a determination her grandmother would have been proud of. She rented a tiny studio in Crown Heights, where the J train rattled past her window at all hours. The apartment was small enough that she could touch both walls if she stretched her arms, but it was hers. She ironed her blouses carefully, bought coffee only when she had enough left after rent, and kept her resume updated, waiting for the break she believed would eventually come. Her first job was in a Flatiron district office, answering phones as a receptionist. Overqualified and overlooked, Destiny made herself indispensable in silence. She had a talent that few noticed until it was too late: the ability to disappear in plain sight while observing everything. She noticed when the managing partner drank his coffee, 742, always black. She knew the paralegal would misplace documents every Friday afternoon. She could sense tension in the room before anyone raised their voice. Professional invisibility became her superpower, allowing her to understand rhythms others ignored. That skill became her greatest weapon the day she sat across from Victor Ashford. The interview took place on a rainy Tuesday morning at Hudson Yards. Destiny waited 43 minutes in a sleek reception area before Victor appeared. The delay wasn't an accident, it was a test. The previous assistant had walked out in tears only an hour earlier. Most candidates would have left in frustration. Destiny stayed, steady and unreadable, her umbrella resting quietly at her side. When she finally entered Victor's office, He didn't look up from his monitor for a full minute. His first words were blunt. "You're underqualified." Most people would have stammered or defended their resume. Destiny did neither. She straightened slightly in her chair and answered, "Perhaps the position has been defined incorrectly, which is why it keeps opening up." The response caught him off guard. Victor's eyes lifted from the screen for the first time. It wasn't arrogance in her tone, it was clarity. She continued, calm and measured. "You don't need management. You need someone who understands that your coldness isn't personal, it's protection." Those words struck a chord Victor didn't show, but he felt them immediately. For years, assistants had tried to manage his schedule, smooth his sharp edges, or seek his approval. None had seen what Destiny had recognized in minutes. His distance wasn't cruelty, but defense. The room went quiet. Rain tapped against the glass walls of the skyscraper. Victor closed his laptop, studying her as if she were a puzzle he couldn't solve. 90 seconds later, he made his decision. "You start tomorrow." Destiny walked out of Hudson Yards with no handshake, no smile, no reassurance. Yet for the first time since moving to New York, she felt she had stepped into a role that fit her quiet strength. She had seen through the man everyone else described as untouchable. What she didn't know was that in recognizing his protection, she had begun to dismantle the walls he had built around himself for decades. Destiny began her role with a strategy most assistants never considered, anticipating Victor before the day even started. If he arrived at the Hudson Yards Tower at 5:30 each morning, she arrived at 5:15. A Chelsea cafe opened early enough for her to collect his preferred black coffee, always at the same temperature. By the time he stepped into his office, her desk already held a concise overnight market summary, filtered from hundreds of global reports. He never asked for it, but he never missed using it either. She learned his rhythms with quiet precision. Victor made his best decisions while moving, so Destiny adapted. Calls with investors or internal teams often shifted into walking meetings along the West Side Highway or through Battery Park City. While others struggled to keep pace, Destiny adjusted naturally, carrying documents in a slim folder, speaking only when necessary, recording outcomes without interrupting his flow. She became the silent metronome that matched his stride. One afternoon in Philadelphia, Victor was negotiating a deal worth hundreds of millions. As the conversation grew tense, Destiny noticed a small gesture, his fingers pressing against his temple, a sign of strain she had seen before. That evening, without a word, she booked a massage therapist to meet him in his hotel suite. She never framed it as self-care or drew attention to it. The appointment appeared discreetly in his calendar. He attended without acknowledgement, but the following morning he looked at her for an extra second before continuing his routine. It was during these months that Destiny uncovered rare glimpses of his humanity. Inside his leather briefcase, usually filled with contracts and reports, she once saw a faded photograph tucked into a side pocket. It was an image of a Detroit factory, the kind of building long abandoned after the collapse of the automotive industry. It was the only personal item he carried, and she never mentioned it. But from then on, she understood that behind the controlled surface, Victor still carried fragments of a life he rarely allowed himself to revisit. Her observations deepened with time. In negotiations, when he secured massive victories, others expected celebration. Instead, Destiny noticed the opposite. His jaw tightened. His shoulders stiffened. He didn't glow with triumph. He braced himself, as if each win came with an unseen cost. To everyone else, Victor looked unstoppable. To Destiny, he looked like a man fighting battles no balance sheet could measure. Victor never thanked her directly. Gratitude wasn't part of his vocabulary, yet his actions revealed recognition. Without announcement, her compensation doubled within 6 months. More telling, he stopped interviewing potential replacements. For years, assistants had been temporary placeholders. Destiny remained. It was as though her presence had ended his restless search, though he never said it aloud. Over the course of that year, a shift began to take shape. Destiny continued to uphold flawless professional boundaries. She spoke with respect, maintained discretion, and avoided familiarity. Yet in quiet ways, she began to see him differently. She noticed the long pauses he took at night, staring out of the glass windows while Manhattan's lights flickered across the river. She sensed the weight he carried when he chose data over memory, efficiency over feeling. Victor, for his part, allowed her closer than anyone before. Not in words or gestures, but in trust. He stopped double-checking her calendar entries. He let her manage correspondence that once never left his hands. He began to rely on her instincts, even when he didn't admit it. Neither spoke of what was growing between them. Both understood the boundaries too well. Yet in those long days and longer nights, something unspoken connected them. She wasn't just an assistant, and he wasn't only a boss. On the surface, the relationship remained professional. Beneath it, an unnamed current carried them forward, building quietly, invisibly, into something neither expected. February 2024 brought Victor Ashford to Chicago with the kind of confidence only 8 months of preparation could justify. The deal on the table was worth $340 million, centered on a historic loop building with commanding views of Millennium Park and frozen Lake Michigan. For Victor, it was more than another acquisition. It was the cornerstone of his strategy to dominate the Midwest real estate market. On paper, the plan was flawless. Every forecast, every projection, every contingency aligned in his favor. The numbers showed inevitable profit. He arrived at the final meeting expecting resistance, but not defeat. The building, however, was held by a family trust with roots stretching back nearly a century. During the negotiations, the trustees uncovered Victor's long-term development blueprint. Buried deep in the paperwork, on page 247, was the line item that broke the room apart: demolition. For the family, this wasn't just a property. Their grandfather had overseen its construction, commissioning handcrafted mahogany paneling for the interior halls and terrazzo floors laid by immigrant craftsmen he paid fairly when others undercut wages. To them, the building was a living archive of sacrifice and integrity. Victor's response was immediate, his tone unflinching. Sentimental craftsmanship doesn't matter. Highest and best use requires modernization. This is business. The words landed like a blade. The trustees exchanged glances, their decision forming in silence. Within minutes, they stood, collected their documents, and walked out. The meeting was over. The deal, once considered inevitable, was gone. For the first time in years, Victor's composure slipped. On the private jet departing Chicago, as the lights of the city faded behind them and Lake Erie stretched below, agitation replaced his usual control. He scrolled through numbers, projections, and missed opportunities with an intensity that felt less like analysis and more like frustration. Destiny, seated across from him, studied quietly. She had watched him dismantle opponents in negotiations without a flicker of doubt. This was different. His jaw was tight, his movements sharp. The collapse of the deal wasn't just financial. It unsettled him in ways he couldn't admit. They weren't negotiating price, she said softly. They were protecting memory. You can't optimize memory with an algorithm. Victor looked up, his expression harder than his voice. Memory doesn't pay dividends. The words were familiar, but something in his tone was new: hesitation. Destiny didn't retreat. That grandfather built something he hoped would outlive him, unchanged. There's something beautiful about that, even if it doesn't make financial sense. Her words settled between them. Victor leaned back, his gaze fixed on the dark horizon beyond the jet's windows. He had spent decades believing that emotion compromised strength, that attachment threatened security. Yet in that moment, confronted with her calm defiance, he felt the ground shift beneath his certainty. She pressed gently, her voice steady. "You're brilliant, but have you forgotten what you're building for? Or maybe you never asked yourself that question." The cabin grew silent. Outside, Pennsylvania's scattered lights glowed far below, indifferent to the man sitting at 30,000 feet with more wealth than most countries, but less clarity than the woman across from him. Victor didn't answer. He couldn't. For the first time in years, his empire of logic felt incomplete. Something had cracked, Not enough to break, but enough to let uncertainty in. Destiny turned back to her notebook, leaving him to his silence. Yet both knew the conversation wasn't finished. The deal in Chicago had collapsed, but what lingered was far larger than a missed opportunity. Something irreversible had begun. March 2024 brought Victor Ashford to Boston for a venture capital summit at the Harbor Hotel. The glass walls of the ballroom reflected the harbor lights, a sharp contrast to the cool professionalism he carried onto the stage. His keynote, as always, focused on predictive analytics in real estate investment, data, trends, and precise forecasts that left little room for debate. Questions followed, polite at first, until one rose from the back of the room. It wasn't about projections, acquisitions, or market trends. The man asked, "Mr. Ashford, you've built extraordinary fortune, but no family, no relationships, no passions beyond tax-advantaged donations. When you look at your empire, who are you building this for?" The room quieted, and even Victor felt the weight of the inquiry. He delivered his standard answer about shareholder value and long-term strategic legacy. The words were clean, calculated, professional, but to anyone listening, including himself, they sounded hollow. He had mastered public speaking, yet no polished sentence could fill the space left by the question. That evening, as the summit ended and the crowd dispersed, Victor asked Destiny to join him on a walk along the harbor walk. The lights of the financial district shimmered across the dark water. Couples strolled near Long Wharf. The New England Aquarium's glass walls glowed faintly against the night. Victor spoke without pretense. "I can recite the cap rates of every property I own. I can list quarterly earnings for my top 15 holdings. I can predict market behavior months in advance. But I can't remember the last time I had dinner with someone who wasn't attached to a business agenda." Destiny matched his pace. "When did you decide being alone was safer than being connected?" Victor paused, staring at the reflections on the harbor. His voice grew quiet, stripped of the usual precision. "My father lost everything because he cared. He poured himself into saving jobs at a factory that was dying. He fought for others more than he protected our family. I watched that happen. I swore I would never carry the same burden. I decided that caring was a liability I couldn't afford." He adjusted the collar of his $3,000 coat, the same one that had accompanied him across multiple cities and countless negotiations. Despite the wealth and the properties that spanned from Manhattan to Miami, the boy from Detroit, the frightened teenager who had seen his family crumble, remained beneath the polished exterior. Destiny didn't respond immediately. She let him speak, absorbing each revelation. Then, gently, she reframed his story. "Your father didn't lose because he loved. He lost because the system was rigged. He showed you what it looks like to care about something beyond profit. You've been running from that lesson your whole life, but it doesn't have to define you forever." Victor turned slightly, considering her words. She continued, soft but firm. "I've watched you close deals worth millions and never celebrate. You win and win and win, and somehow still look like you're losing something important. You've been measuring victory by numbers, not by what matters most." The air between them was quiet except for the distant hum of traffic and the gentle lapping of water against the harbor's edge. Victor, usually unshakable, let himself feel the absence that had shadowed him for decades. For the first time, he admitted, without formulas, spreadsheets, or projections, that success had left him incomplete. He had mastered the material world, yet remained blind to the value of connection, the richness of being seen and understood by someone who mattered. Destiny walked beside him, silently offering the space for reflection. Her presence, consistent and steady over the past year, now carried weight beyond professional boundaries. She had seen the man beneath the CEO persona, and in that quiet harbor, Victor realized the walls he had spent a lifetime constructing were no longer sufficient to protect him from the truth he was facing. Boston's lights stretched across the water, a reminder that even in the midst of wealth and achievement, the human need for recognition and care could not be replaced by numbers alone. Victor didn't answer her immediately. He only slowed his pace, shoulders easing slightly. That night, The questions raised in the ballroom and the reflections along the harbor became the first small cracks in the armor he had relied upon for decades. The journey of change had begun, unseen by anyone outside the quiet walk of the two figures along the water. April 2024 brought Victor Ashford and Destiny Clark to Miami for what was meant to be a routine evaluation of luxury condos along Miami Beach. Meetings stretched across Brickell and Coconut Grove, discussions with developers and investors measured in spreadsheets and profit margins. Dinner followed at a waterfront restaurant near the Perez Art Museum, overlooking Biscayne Bay, with city lights reflecting across calm water. The evening carried the expected precision and politeness of business, yet beneath the surface, something shifted in Victor. Instead of returning to their separate hotel rooms, he asked Destiny to walk with him along the South Point Park Pier. The night air was warm and filled with the scent of salt. Cruise ships glided past, their lights like small cities on the water. Miami Beach's Art Deco buildings glowed, stretching along the coast. Victor led the way with his usual careful posture, but there was tension in his shoulders, a quiet urgency that Destiny had not seen before. "I need to tell you something," he said suddenly, stopping to look out at the Atlantic. His voice, even in the breeze, carried an uncharacteristic vulnerability. "And if I stop, I won't start again." Destiny met his gaze, sensing the gravity behind the words. "You've become the first person I think about every morning," he admitted. "Not because I need you to manage my schedule, but because I wonder what you think about things that have nothing to do with work." His hands, usually steady when negotiating millions, fidgeted briefly. "You're the first person I want to tell about a deal when it closes. You're the only one whose opinion I trust. And that terrifies me." Victor paused, taking in the lights along the pier, as if they were evidence of a world he had long avoided understanding. "I've built my life on the idea that emotional attachment is weakness. I believed love was a distraction for people who couldn't handle real success. But facing that idea now, I realize I've been wrong." Destiny's heart quickened. She had maintained professional boundaries for a year, silently noticing every detail, supporting him while keeping herself in check. She had watched him operate at the highest level, brilliant yet unreachable. And now, here, on the edge of the Atlantic, he was exposing a part of himself no spreadsheet could measure. "Maybe the greatest poverty isn't lacking money," he continued, voice quieter, almost confessing to the sea itself. "Maybe it's lacking someone who sees you, really sees you, and doesn't need you to be anything other than human." Destiny's lips trembled. For months she had recognized the cracks in his armor, moments when the man beneath the empire's surface had revealed himself in small gestures. A photograph tucked in his briefcase, a careful note on a calendar, an instinctive concern for others he never acknowledged publicly. Tonight, those moments converged into words she had waited to hear, and her tears reflected the Miami lights, dancing across her cheeks. Victor's eyes held her steady, searching for comprehension, searching for permission to let the walls fall. He had operated for decades in a world of control, precision, and detachment, yet in this moment, he risked everything he believed defined him. Destiny's voice was soft but clear. "I see you," she said, her fingers brushing the handrail, steady despite the emotion rising in her. "I've seen you through the work, through the quiet. I know who you are beneath the office and the empire." Victor inhaled, a long, deliberate pause, as if drawing courage from her presence. "I've spent years building value that can be quantified. Yet for the first time, I'm realizing the most important value isn't in a balance sheet. It's in being known, in being understood, in trusting someone with yourself." They stood on the pier together, the hum of distant engines and the occasional call of a gull marking the quiet of the night. The lights of Miami shimmered on the water, a city that never truly slept. Yet in that instant, all outside concern dissolved. Destiny's tears fell freely. She had spent a year supporting this complicated, brilliant, wounded man without letting the closeness interfere with her own life. Now, his confession confirmed the depth of what she had quietly known. He needed her beyond the role of assistant, and she had already chosen to care for the man beneath the public image. Victor, usually precise and exact, stepped closer. He lowered his voice, almost a whisper. I don't know how to do this. How to feel this fully. How to be seen and not retreat. Destiny placed her hand lightly on his arm. Neither do I, she admitted. Maybe not everything needs a strategy. Some things have to be felt, allowed, and trusted. He nodded, eyes tracing the horizon, and then reached for her hand. The gesture was simple, yet monumental, an acknowledgement that the rules of control and detachment could be set aside, that vulnerability could exist without consequence. She took his hand in return. For the first time in decades, Victor Ashford allowed himself to exist outside the walls he had built. In the soft, salt-scented air of Miami, under the lights of a city defined by wealth and ambition, two people recognized the value of being fully known and fully seen. That night on South Point Park Pier, the empire and the calculations could wait. Here, only the truth of their connection mattered. Destiny looked at Victor, her eyes steady despite the tears glistening on her cheeks. I see you, she said. I've seen you since that first interview. Her voice carried the weight of months spent quietly observing him. Not the CEO, not the empire, but the boy from Detroit who had learned that vulnerability led to pain, and the man who had built walls so high he forgot what they were meant to protect. She spoke carefully, detailing what she had noticed. How she adjusted schedules when exhaustion showed in his posture. How she quietly managed tasks so he could focus without distraction. How she ensured his personal gestures of generosity remained unnoticed by others. She even mentioned, softly, the donation she traced to a Detroit youth program, knowing it had been made through a shell company to maintain anonymity. Victor's brow furrowed slightly. You traced that? Destiny's small smile was almost mischievous. I trace everything. I'm an excellent assistant, she replied. There was no judgment in her voice, only acknowledgement of her attention to detail and the care she had given him. He exhaled, a mix of astonishment and something unspoken, relief, fear, desire. His voice lowered, fragile in a way it had never been in boardrooms or negotiations. You're everything, and I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be this. She reached for his hand, her touch firm but gentle. Neither do I, she admitted. But maybe not everything needs to be optimized and strategized. Maybe some things you just have to trust. Victor hesitated, scanning her face as if seeking a map for navigating this new territory. He had spent decades making decisions with precision, controlling every outcome. Yet here, on the pier, the only option was uncertainty. And for the first time, he chose it. He extended his hand fully, reaching for hers, an act driven not by logic or calculation, but by something far riskier, feeling. Destiny took it, letting their fingers intertwine. The simplicity of the gesture belied the intensity of what had transpired. Months of silent observation, of careful attention and quiet loyalty, converged into this single moment. She had seen the worst and the hidden depths of the man who dominated skylines and markets, yet she had also become essential to the life he had built. They stood together under the Miami stars, the soft glow of Art Deco lights behind them, the ocean stretching endlessly beyond the pier. There were no answers yet, no declarations beyond the truth of their connection. Both knew the complexity of merging two lives that had operated so independently. Victor with his empire and Destiny with her careful boundaries. But there was agreement in their silence, a mutual willingness to explore what had been revealed. Victor spoke again, quieter this time, almost as a confirmation to himself. I don't know how to be this person. Someone who lets themselves feel. Someone who allows someone else to see them without retreating. Destiny's grip on his hand tightened, a small reassurance. Maybe being seen doesn't have to be perfect, she said. Maybe it's enough to start, to accept that it's messy and real. He nodded slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing, though only slightly. It was the first crack in a lifetime of walls. He allowed himself to breathe, to exist outside the calculations and contracts, and to acknowledge that this connection, the trust, the recognition, the possibility of love, was not a liability but a choice he could make. For a long while neither spoke. The only sound was the gentle lapping of waves against the pier, a rhythm far simpler than the metrics and schedules that usually define their lives. Both understood the significance of the moment. They were not stepping into a finished story, nor a neatly resolved ending. They were beginning a process, one that would demand patience, honesty, and constant negotiation of boundaries. It would be complicated. It would be imperfect. But it was theirs. Victor finally broke the silence, his voice low but firm. I've spent years building value that can be measured in dollars and assets. Now I realize the most important value isn't in anything I can own. It's in connection, in trust, in being seen. Destiny squeezed his hand in response. And now you are. You're being seen, Victor. Not for what you own or control, but for who you are. That matters more than any empire. He let the words settle over them, absorbing the weight of truth without trying to manage or optimize it. And then, slowly, deliberately, he leaned slightly closer, acknowledging the risk and allowing this closeness. Destiny mirrored the gesture, neither retreating, both grounded in the shared understanding that they were beginning something neither fully knew how to navigate, but both had chosen to embrace. The city lights shimmered behind them, the stars above reflecting a quiet certainty, that their lives had intersected not because of circumstance, but because each had seen the other when it mattered most. And in this recognition, the first step of real transformation began. Here, on South Point Park Pier, the rules of the office, the empire, and the calculations fell away. What remained was connection, truth, and the courage to take the first step toward a life that could not be measured in profits or property, only in presence and understanding. This was not a conclusion. It was the beginning of a journey, a deliberate choice to explore vulnerability, trust, and what it meant to be truly known. And for Victor and Destiny, it was the first time they allowed themselves to take a step together, without certainty, without guarantee, only with mutual recognition that this connection mattered more than anything they had previously built. Victor and Destiny stood on the pier, the night stretching out like a quiet promise. What had unfolded between them was not just a personal revelation. It was a demonstration of how much courage it takes to let someone pass the walls we build around ourselves. For decades, Victor had hidden behind precision, logic, and control. Every interaction, every decision was a shield against being seen, against being hurt. Destiny had the rare ability to see through all of that. She recognized the boy from Detroit who had learned that caring invited pain, and the man who had created a life measured in numbers but starved in human connection. Her presence had reminded him that true strength does not come from isolation or invulnerability. It comes from allowing someone else to witness who you really are, to know you fully, and to remain committed despite the imperfections. Victor had accumulated wealth beyond comprehension. Properties in Manhattan, Miami, and cities across the country, an empire built on strategy and calculated risk. Yet he was profoundly impoverished in the ways that mattered: companionship, emotional closeness, shared triumphs, and vulnerability. Money, influence, and assets could not fill the emptiness of a life lived behind walls. No portfolio, no stock option, no luxury residence could replace the simple but profound experience of being understood and valued as a person. Their journey together had begun with boundaries, observation, and careful devotion. Destiny maintained her identity while offering trust. Victor was learning, slowly and awkwardly, the language of emotion. How to be present without calculating outcomes, how to let himself care without fearing loss, how to connect without controlling. Each step forward required intention, patience, and humility. The challenges ahead were real. Office gossip would whisper around them, his instinct to retreat into work when overwhelmed would persist, and her doubts would need acknowledgement. Power dynamics, financial disparity, and long-standing habits could have complicated any ordinary relationship. Yet the reward of building a life together promised to be more demanding and more fulfilling than any deal, any negotiation, or any measure of business success. Love was no longer a distraction. For Victor, it became the measure against which all other success mattered. Achievements gained meaning only when shared with someone who truly saw him, someone whose care was not conditional on performance or results. Vulnerability proved to be the strongest foundation, the one that made everything else worthwhile. The courage to be known, to allow someone inside the carefully guarded life of a billionaire CEO, became the most significant act of investment he had ever made. Their partnership, like any meaningful connection, was unfinished and evolving. There would be awkward moments, uncertainty, and missteps. There would be lessons in patience, negotiation, and compromise. Yet every choice to remain open and present reinforced the truth that the greatest value in life is found not in assets or titles, but in each other. The most important merger was not of companies, but of hearts willing to risk being vulnerable. Victor and Destiny's story stood as a reminder that real connection requires seeing past hardened exteriors. Walls often protect wounds rather than strength. Emotional poverty can exist even amid extraordinary wealth. The courage to let someone in, to allow them to witness your flaws and still remain, was an achievement more profound than any financial milestone. What they built together could not be quantified, measured, or ranked. It existed in trust, care, attention, and shared moments of honesty. As they walked back along the pier, hands still intertwined, there was an understanding between them. Life together would not be a perfect narrative. It would require constant effort, awareness, and mutual support. Yet they had discovered that building a shared life, with all its difficulty and unpredictability, was worth every risk. Love was no longer a weakness to manage, but a strength that gave every other aspect of life depth and purpose. Sometimes the most successful people are the loneliest, and sometimes the quietest person in the room sees what everyone else misses. Victor learned that building an empire meant nothing if there was no one to share it with. Destiny demonstrated that true strength is not in walls, but in letting someone witness the truth of who you are. Their story was not a conclusion. It was a beginning, a lesson in courage, connection, and the value of being truly known. If this story touched you, subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us continue sharing stories that show how courage and connection transform lives. Victor and Destiny's journey reminds us all that the greatest investment is in people, not properties.